On a soft grey morning, when the rain had settled comfortably over the town, Mr. Vale unlocked the municipal map room and went in to move a few very small lines. On a soft grey morning, when the rain had settled comfortably over the town, Mr. Vale unlocked the municipal map room and went in to move a few very small lines. The map room occupied the second floor of the old survey office, above a courtyard where 3 bicycles leaned beneath a corrugated shelter and collected silver beads along their handlebars. It was a long room with high windows, green-shaded lamps, and a pleasant smell of paper, dust, cotton tape, and the faint mineral scent of rain passing over stone. Along one wall stood shallow wooden drawers with brass label holders. Along another were shelves of rolled plans, each tied with cream ribbon and carrying a tag in handwriting that ranged from elegant to practical. Mr. Vale liked all of it, though he was particularly fond of the drawers. They opened with a low wooden sigh, as if relieved to be consulted. He hung his damp coat on the 3rd peg, the first 2 being slightly loose, and placed his umbrella in a copper stand that had once belonged to the Department of Weights and Measures. The stand was wider than any umbrella required. In earlier days it had held a set of ceremonial measuring rods, though no one remembered what had made the rods ceremonial. Perhaps they had possessed tassels. Municipal history was full of tassels that had quietly disappeared. Mr. Vale set the kettle on its ring, listened to its modest hum, and opened the day book. There were 7 corrections waiting. 7 was a comfortable number, enough to occupy the hours without encouraging haste. A new bench had been placed beside the duck pond. A narrow footpath behind the bakery had been paved. Number 18, Willow Crescent, had acquired a porch. The drinking fountain in Market Square had been moved 2 meters east during repairs and, having proved satisfactory there, had remained. A row of young lime trees now stood along Briar Lane. The allotment boundary at Plot 46 had been straightened by mutual agreement. Finally, a postbox at the corner of Bell Street had changed from a freestanding oval to one set into a wall. None of these events had disturbed the peace of the town. They had merely made portions of its maps very slightly untrue. Mr. Vale considered the list while the kettle warmed. A map, he believed, did not need to know everything. It did not need to know that Mrs. Peake fed the ducks at 9:10, nor that the bakery window fogged first in its lower left corner, nor that the new porch at number 18 smelled strongly of fresh pine whenever the weather was wet. But where a line claimed there was no porch, and a porch now stood, the line ought to be informed. It was only polite. He made tea in a brown pot and carried it to the central table. The table was broad enough for a map of the entire town and sturdy enough, according to an old inventory, to support 400 weight. No one had tested this in recent memory. Its surface bore pale scratches from rulers, tiny dark pinpricks, and one circular stain left by a cup in 1978. That stain appeared on no official plan, but Mr. Vale could have located it to within a millimeter. He set his own cup safely on a cork mat. The first task was the duck pond bench. He opened drawer P-differ and lifted out the park sheet between 2 clean boards. The paper was thick and cool, with the mild waviness that came from years of damp winters and dry summers. Unfolding it produced a series of soft, orderly sounds. There was the pond, a blue-grey shape like a potato viewed with affection. There were the gravel paths, the bandstand, the gardener's shed, 6 labelled flower beds, and a small triangle indicating the drinking tap. Mr. Vale weighted the corners with 4 cloth bags filled with fine shot. The bags had been sewn by a surveyor's aunt long ago, using striped fabric left over from a deck chair. He found the bench in the site inspector's note, oak, 1.8 meters long, facing southwest, positioned beneath the second horse chestnut from the northern gate. The note included a small sketch and the observation that the view was pleasant. Pleasantness had no standard map symbol, which was perhaps just as well. Mr. Vale selected a 0.25mm pen, tested it on scrap paper, and drew the bench as a neat black dash with two tiny end marks. It took less than a minute. He then spent several more minutes looking at it, not because anything was wrong, but because a newly added mark deserved a short period in which to become accustomed to its surroundings. Outside, rain tapped the windows with the evenness of fingertips on a library desk. Water traveled down the panes, joined other drops, and made temporary rivers across the glass. Beyond them, slate roofs softened into grey layers. A chimney gave out a thin strand of smoke that flattened beneath the low clouds. The town was going about its damp business, bread cooling, letters being sorted, floors being swept around chair legs, and gutters performing their one notable duty. Mr. Vale entered the alteration in the margin, bench installed, verified, scale 1 to 1250. He dated it and added his initials. His initials, EV, were compact and upright. Over 26 years they had appeared beside widened culverts, renamed lanes, demolished sheds, reinstated sheds, adjusted curbs, planted hedges, and one unusually persistent traffic island. There was reassurance in leaving two small letters beside a change. They did not proclaim ownership. They simply said that someone had looked carefully. The paved path behind the bakery required a different sheet. Before fetching it, Mr. Vale rinsed his pen and stood it nib up in a ceramic holder shaped like a tree stump. The holder had been a retirement gift to his predecessor, who had not liked ornaments and had therefore left it behind. Mr. Vale found it useful. He walked to drawer H9, reading labels as he passed: drainage, north, easements, footbridges, gas lamps, historical, curbstones, selected, milestones, public conveniences, closed. The labels gave the town a second existence, one arranged alphabetically and stored flat. The bakery path appeared on a survey from 11 years earlier as a dotted line between Flour Mill Lane and the rear service yard. For generations it had been packed earth with gravel, then gravel with weeds, then weeds with islands of gravel. Now it was paved with small rectangular bricks the color of toasted oats. Mr. Vale had walked it 2 days ago. Rainwater lay in the shallow joints and the air behind the bakery smelled of yeast, warm sugar, and wet cardboard. A delivery cart had stood with its back doors open. Inside were empty flour sacks folded into patient squares. He remembered placing one shoe carefully before the other while counting the path's width. Measurements made familiar places newly interesting. A person could pass down an alley for 20 years without wondering whether it was 1.6 meters wide or 1.7. Once a tape measure was unrolled, however, the alley seemed almost pleased to provide an answer. This one was 1.68 meters at the drain and 1.72 beside the bakery wall. Mr. Vale had recorded the average, since maps, like good hosts, occasionally smoothed small differences for everyone's comfort. On the sheet he replaced the dotted line with two fine continuous lines. He used a ruler with a cork backing, holding it lightly so it would not polish the paper. At the bend near the downpipe he turned the ruler by a degree or two, drew again, and added the paving notation. The alteration was modest, but the path looked more settled. It no longer wandered as a suggestion. It had become a place where prams rolled without jolting and delivery workers wheeled baskets of rolls while the bricks gave off their quiet earthy smell after rain. At 9:30, Mrs. Dowlow from Records came in carrying a folder and a plate covered by another plate. She set the folder in the incoming tray and revealed 2 plain biscuits. They had currants in them, she said, though not enough to cause excitement. Mr. Vale thanked her and agreed that this was the proper quantity of currants for a working morning. They stood at the table and ate one each. The biscuits were dry at the edges, softer in the middle, and faintly buttery. Crumbs fell on the cork mats and were gathered with a folded index card. Mrs. Dowlow looked at the park plan and admired the new benchmark. She had passed the actual bench on Sunday and reported that an elderly spaniel had been asleep beneath it. Mr. Vale considered adding the spaniel, but only for the length of the joke. Then Mrs. Dowlow returned downstairs, her shoes making smaller sounds with each step. The porch at number 18, Willow Crescent, was next. Residential sheets were among the map room's most companionable documents. Their rows of houses, gardens, sheds, passages, and front steps formed a kind of quiet geometry. Here were thousands of daily routes reduced to ink, from bedroom to landing, from gate to door, from kitchen to washing line. The maps did not show the blue bowls on window sills or the worn patch in a hallway carpet, yet the shapes seemed to hold room for such things. Willow Crescent curved like a loose handle around a patch of grass. Its houses had been built in 1932, when bay windows were considered cheerful and coal cupboards were considered necessary. Number 18 stood midway along the inner curve. The new porch extended 1.2 meters from the front wall and had a pitched roof with 2 glazed side panels. Mr. Vale had received the builder's completion drawing, made in blue pencil on thin paper. It included every screw and flashing strip, far more detail than the town map could sensibly bear. He laid tracing film over the plan and transferred only the outline. The porch became 3 small strokes, hardly larger than a staple. He sharpened a pencil with a hand sharpener, turning it slowly over a waste tray. A pale wooden curl emerged, smelling briefly of cedar. The pencil point became symmetrical and smooth. He drew guidelines so faint that they seemed to be thinking about appearing, then inked the outline and waited for it to dry. Waiting for ink was a small but honorable part of the occupation. The newer inks dried quickly, yet Mr. Vale maintained the old pause. He would sit back, fold his hands, and allow air to do its share of the work. During such pauses he noticed the room's minor noises, the kettle cooling with a tick, the radiator murmuring behind its grill, paper adjusting beneath a weight, rain whispering in the downpipe. A person could spend a life believing silence was empty when in fact it was comfortably furnished. The porch reminded him of the town's oldest surviving building plan, drawn for a bootmaker in 1811. That plan showed a shop, 2 rooms, a yard, and a privy marked with an unexpectedly graceful P. The bootmaker had requested permission to add a wooden awning so customers might examine laces without standing in rain. The awning was approved on the condition that it be painted every 3rd year. For nearly a century, notes confirmed the painting: ochre, brown, brown again, respectable green, dark green, and finally something called serviceable buff. Then the awning was removed, the shop became a stationer's, and the graceful P remained in the archive, guarding its little square of yard. Mr. Vale entered the porch correction and returned the sheet to its drawer. He did not slide maps quickly. He supported each one with both hands and let the drawer receive it. Paper lasted a long time when no one expected it to hurry. The drawer closed with a padded thump. He checked its brass label, though he already knew what it said. By 10:30 the room had grown brighter without becoming sunny. The clouds lifted just enough to show their separate layers. Across the courtyard, rain darkened the brick wall in uneven patches. A pigeon stood on the shelter roof, round and patient, occasionally bending to drink from a shallow seam. Mr. Vale refreshed the teapot with hot water. The second cup was paler than the first and suited the middle of the morning. The Market Square fountain involved both old and new records. He fetched the current utilities sheet, the conservation plan, and an 1896 map mounted on linen. The fountain had moved several times in its life, though never very far. It began in the square's northwest corner, close to the horse trough. In 1924 it was shifted south to accommodate a telephone kiosk. In 1967 it went into storage while the square was resurfaced with concrete slabs of determined plainness. It returned in 1985 near the bus shelter. Now, following repairs to the underground pipe, it stood 2 meters east of that position. The fountain was not restless. Circumstances simply kept arranging themselves around it. It was made of grey granite and had a brass push-button polished by thumbs. When pressed, water rose in a modest arc for 4 seconds. Local children had long understood that partially covering the nozzle produced a sideways spray, though this knowledge had never entered the official operating instructions. The basin collected rain, copper coins, small leaves, and sometimes the reflection of the clock tower. In winter the council wrapped the fountain in sacking, giving it the appearance of a parcel no one had yet decided to post. Mr. Vale measured 2 meters east on the plan. At this scale the journey was only a little more than the width of his pen nib. He erased the former symbol with a white vinyl eraser using short strokes. Fine crumbs gathered like grated cheese. He brushed them into his palm, never blowing across a map, because breath carried moisture and because one could not predict where eraser crumbs might go. Then he placed the symbol in its new location, a small circle with a central dot. For a while he compared the historical sheets. The square's outline remained, while its contents changed: market stalls, trough, kiosk, bus shelter, flower tubs, bicycle racks. On one map there was a weighbridge. On another, a cabman's shelter with room for 12 men and a stove. The maps made time look tidy. One thing vanished, another appeared, and dates sat politely in margins. Actual time was less organized, full of overlaps, leftover bolts, remembered shortcuts, and cupboards containing keys to doors that no longer existed. Mr. Vale liked both versions. He placed the fountain's old position in the retired features register. Nothing was entirely erased from the map room. Superseded marks moved into other folders, where they rested among former boundaries and discontinued rights of way. The archive contained roads that had never been built, ponds that had dried into playing fields, and a proposed public lavatory cancelled after a lengthy discussion about ventilation. These places possessed a papery afterlife. They could still be visited by opening the proper drawer. At 11:15, the radiator gave a soft knock. It often did this once in the morning, as though announcing that it had considered the matter of warmth and found the room acceptable. Mr. Vale walked to the window and touched the leaves of the potted aspidistra. Dust had gathered along their central ridges. He wiped each leaf with a damp cloth, supporting it from beneath. The plant had been in the office longer than he had. It grew one new leaf most years and asked no one to make a fuss. The young lime trees along Briar Lane required a green pencil and the arboricultural schedule. There were 14 trees, evenly spaced at 8-meter intervals, except near a driveway where the interval became 11 and then 5. They were small standards with straight trunks, flexible branches, and circles of dark mulch around their bases. Each was held by 2 stakes and a broad rubber tie. In spring their new leaves had been almost translucent. Now, in the rainy autumn, they were yellowing from the tips. Mr. Vale had inspected them on a still afternoon. Briar Lane was not named for any briars currently present. The name dated from a field boundary shown in an enclosure map, beside which the surveyor had written much bramble. That phrase had endured in the naming file because it was both descriptive and difficult to improve. The modern lane contained semi-detached houses, low brick walls, and wheelie bins in varying shades of green. It smelled that day of wet leaves and someone's laundry vent. He marked the trees as 14 delicate green circles. On maps, mature trees were shown with irregular crowns, but new trees received simple rings, as neat as buttons. Over the years, if they thrived, their symbols might be enlarged. There was something patient in mapping a small tree. The mark described not only what stood there now but the shade that might one day fall across the pavement, the linden scent that might drift through an upstairs window, and the sticky bracts that might cling to parked cars. The word lime caused occasional confusion in visitors who expected tropical fruit. These trees were lindens, unrelated to citrus, and no small green limes would ever appear along Briar Lane. The old word came by a winding linguistic path from linden, losing letters as a footpath loses gravel. Mr. Vale had once explained this to a school group. One child had asked whether the council could plant rail lime trees instead. He said the climate would object. The child considered this and replied that climates were often unnecessarily strict. Mr. Vale had written the remark on a slip of paper and kept it in the miscellaneous drawer. He counted the circles twice, first from north to south and then from south to north. 14 both ways. Counting in reverse did not alter the trees, but it pleased him. He added the planting date and species abbreviation, Til Cor, for Tilia cordata. Latin names sat comfortably on maps. They were compact, steady, and indifferent to local nicknames. Somewhere below, a door closed. Pipes hummed. The rain resumed with slightly larger drops. Lunch was taken at 12:30 on a chair near the radiator. Mr. Vale unwrapped 2 slices of brown bread with cucumber and mild cheese. The wax paper made a dry crackle. He had a small apple, a screw-top flask of vegetable soup, and 3 radishes with their leaves removed. The soup smelled of leek and potato. Steam clouded his spectacles, and he waited for them to clear on their own. There was no need to wipe away every mist immediately. While eating, he read a pamphlet titled Notes on the Standardization of Municipal Map Cabinets, issued in 1954. It recommended birch runners, brass pulls, and a drawer a depth of not less than 2 1/4 inches. It warned against storing tracing cloth near radiators and devoted a stern paragraph to the dangers of paper clips. Mr. Vale found the tone soothing. The authors had believed deeply that drawers mattered, and in this they were correct. A shallow drawer had only one duty, but it performed that duty with admirable thoroughness. The pamphlet included a photograph of 6 map clerks standing beside a new cabinet. All wore jackets. One held a set square. Another rested one hand on the cabinet top with restrained pride. Behind them, the window showed a plane tree in summer leaf. Mr. Vale wondered what they had eaten for lunch and whether the drawer runners had stayed true. He imagined that at least one of them had favored cucumber sandwiches. The thought asked nothing further of him. After lunch he washed his cup and spoon in the little sink. The tap squeaked at the midpoint between on and off. Water ran cold, then lukewarm, carrying a few crumbs into the metal strainer. He dried the cup with a check towel and placed it upside down beside the kettle. The afternoon corrections waited beneath their boards. There was comfort in work that remained exactly where one had left it. Plot 46 lay in the eastern allotments, beyond the cemetery wall and beside a narrow stream called Tinker's Beck. The allotment plan was a cheerful grid of numbered rectangles, though the actual plots contained much more variety: bean poles, sheds, watering cans, compost heaps, marigolds, cabbages under netting, and chairs of domestic origin that had retired outdoors. Plot 46 had shared a boundary with Plot 47 at a slight angle. By mutual agreement, the tenants had straightened it, exchanging two thin triangles of soil so nearly equal that no money was involved. The agreement form bore both signatures and a sketch in ballpoint pen. One triangle was labelled a bit with rhubarb and the other a bit near waterbird. Mr. Vale admired this precision. Legal documents sometimes became clearer when vegetables were involved. The new fence ran from the northwest corner post to a point beside the pear tree, making each plot easier to cultivate. The pear tree itself stood on Plot 47 and produced, according to an attached note, small hard fruit suitable for stewing. He opened the allotment survey. Its linen backing had softened at the folds and smelled faintly of a dry attic. The original plan dated to 1919, when the land was divided into plots for returning servicemen and local families. Each plot was 10 rods long. A rod, 16.5 feet, remained peculiarly at home in allotments, where old measurements persisted among modern seed packets. An allotment of 10 square rods was sometimes called a pole, though a pole could also mean the rod itself. Measurement, when given enough history, became less exact in language even as it remained exact on the ground. Mr. Vale found this forgivable. He erased the slanting boundary and drew the straight one. The movement on paper was perhaps 3 millimeters at its widest. He added the agreement reference and checked that the pear tree symbol remained on the correct side. Then he placed a sheet of blotting paper over the revision and pressed lightly. The blotter had turned pale blue in places from decades of copying ink. It resembled a cloudy sky seen in a puddle. Through the window came the muted scrape of a bicycle stand and a bell rung once. A postal worker crossed the courtyard with a hood pulled over her cap. Her red trolley made 2 tracks in the wet. The pigeon had gone, leaving only a feather held flat by rain. Mr. Vale watched the trolley disappear under the archway. A moment later he heard its wheels on the passage tiles, a rolling murmur that faded toward the front office. The postbox correction seemed well timed. Bell Street was one of the town's shorter streets, with a church at one end and a hardware shop at the other. The old postbox had stood on the pavement near number 7, an oval pillar box painted red, with a black base and a small white tablet showing collection times. During pavement widening it had been removed. A wall box was installed in the brick frontage of the former dairy, now an office for a firm that repaired photocopiers. Mr. Vale had always liked postboxes as map symbols. They were shown by a tiny circle and the letters PB, a compact arrangement that looked almost like a face wearing spectacles. Wall boxes used a different mark, a short rectangle attached to the building line. The distinction mattered to postal services, conservation officers, and people giving directions. One could not meet someone beside the pillar box if the pillar box had become part of a wall. One could, but the meeting would begin with mild uncertainty. The history file showed that the first postbox in the town arrived in 1856 and was painted green. Red became standard later, partly because green boxes were difficult to see in country lanes. The earliest box had a vertical slot, and rain sometimes entered with the letters. A local ironmonger designed a small hood for it and submitted an invoice for 7 shillings. The invoice survived. The hood did not. Such was the archive's uneven generosity. It remembered the price of shelter more readily than the shelter itself. Mr. Vale removed the circle from the pavement and drew the wall rectangle. He updated the collection point overlay and wrote relocated, not replaced. The distinction pleased the conservation officer, who tracked historic street furniture with a seriousness Mr. Vale respected. Ordinary objects acquired dignity when someone bothered to distinguish their movements. A box could spend a century receiving birthday cards, bills, forms, apologies, invitations, and envelopes containing nothing more dramatic than a change of address. Then it could move 6 meters and continue. Only one correction remained, but the afternoon was broad and quiet. Mr. Vale decided first to sharpen the room's full set of pencils. There were 12 in a wooden tray, hard pencils for guidelines, softer ones for field sketches, blue for water, green for planting, red for proposed work, and yellow for annotations that should be visible without dominating. He sharpened them one by one. Each made a different small sound in the sharpener. The softer graphite turned with a muffled rasp, the hard points whispered against the blade. He aligned them afterward with their tips facing left. He also refilled the water jar used for brushes, trimmed a frayed end from a length of cotton tape, and replaced 2 brass drawer labels that had begun to tilt. These tasks did not appear in the day book. A room, however, accumulated tiny needs, and a person working there learned to notice them. The left corner of a mat curled. A hinge wanted oil. A stack of tissue required squaring. None was urgent, which made attending to it especially pleasant. Urgent things announced themselves. Quiet things waited to be seen. At 3, the rain became very fine, more mist than drops. The window seemed covered by a single sheet of grey silk. Mr. Vale made his final pot of tea and opened the folder for the drinking fountain, then realized with mild amusement that he had already moved the fountain that morning. The 7th item was not the fountain but the replacement of a small wooden footbridge in Hazel Meadows. He checked the list. Indeed, there it was, written between the lime trees and postbox, its line partly hidden by a fold. 7 corrections remained 7, his counting had been sound, but his sequence had wandered. Maps corrected wandering. Lists occasionally created it. Hazel Meadows was a strip of public grassland beside the river, used by dog walkers, slow cyclists, and people who wished to sit somewhere without buying anything. A drainage channel crossed its lower end. The bridge over this channel had been replaced board by board until, according to a philosophical note from Parks, none of the original bridge remained. Since its dimensions and position were unchanged, the map required no altered outline. It required only a revision to the asset number and material note, oak boards in place of treated pine, galvanized fixings in place of iron. This raised an old question, though not an alarming one. If every board of a bridge had been replaced, was it a new bridge or the old bridge freshly supplied with boards? Mr. Vale had encountered the question in several forms. A bench could receive new slats and new legs. A shed could receive new walls, roof felt, hinges, and door. A map itself could be recopied, patched, relined, and mounted on new cloth. The municipal answer was practical. If the asset number remained, the bridge remained. Philosophy might continue after office hours if it wished. He found the meadow sheet and located the bridge, drawn as 2 parallel lines over a blue dash. Beside it stood the number HZDB03. He wrote the new materials in the register, dated the renewal, and added the contractor's name. On the map itself he made no visible change. This was perhaps the gentlest revision of the day, altering the record so that the unchanged mark meant something newly accurate. Mr. Vale pictured the bridge in rain. The oak boards would be dark honey brown, their grain raised slightly, beads of water gathering around the galvanized screw heads. Beneath, the drainage channel would move slowly between grasses, carrying fragments of leaf and occasional bubbles toward the river. Shoes would cross with a hollow sequence of notes. Dogs would pause at the midpoint to inspect smells. In summer the boards would warm in the sun and release a dry woody scent. None of this fitted beside the asset number, but it belonged there invisibly. He finished the tea, now cool enough to taste faintly of the metal flask in which the milk had been carried. The clock on the wall moved toward 4. It was a simple clock with black hands, no second hand, and numerals clear enough to read from the far drawers. Because there was no second hand, time in the map room seemed to proceed by calm, minute-sized portions. Mr. Vale preferred it that way. Seconds were useful in races and laboratory work, but maps rarely required them. He began the closing checks. Each revised sheet received a protective tissue, an entry in the alteration log, and a small pencil date on its storage sleeve. The bench went back to P4. The bakery path returned to H9. Willow Crescent settled into residential west. The fountain joined Market Square utilities. Briar Lane slipped beneath tree planting, currant. The allotment plan lay flat in E12. Bell Street entered Street Furniture Central, and Hazel Meadows went into watercourses and crossings. Drawer after drawer opened and closed. There was a rhythm to returning maps that differed from taking them out. In the morning, each sheet had carried a question. By late afternoon it carried an answer, although answer was perhaps too grand a word for a benchmark or revised fence. It carried an adjustment. The room liked adjustments. Its purpose was not to freeze the town, but to keep pace with it at a dignified walking speed. Buildings went up, walls came down, saplings thickened, paths acquired paving, and the ink followed when it could. Mr. Vale wiped the central table with a soft cloth. Under the green lamps, the wood shone in broad muted bands. He emptied the eraser crumbs and pencil shavings into the bin. The shavings gave off one last breath of cedar. He washed the nibs, dried them on lint-free paper, and fitted their caps. The smallest nib had trapped a single black drop, which spread into the paper like a tiny night map of an unknown island. He left it to dry. Downstairs, voices passed along the corridor as the public counter closed. Someone laughed softly. A metal shutter rolled halfway, paused, and rolled the rest. The building seemed to loosen around its occupants. Pipes clicked in the walls. The rain stopped so gradually that Mr. Vale noticed only when the courtyard gutter became audible by itself, dripping at intervals into a square drain. He opened the day book and reviewed his entries. 7 corrections: bench, path, porch, fountain, trees, boundary, postbox. Then the bridge, which made 8. He counted again and discovered that the bridge renewal had arrived in Mrs. Dallow's folder that morning and was not on the original list. This explained everything without improving it greatly. 8 was also a comfortable number. He drew a line beneath the entries with a ruler, wrote the date, and signed his compact initials. For several minutes he stood by the cabinets, looking along the brass handles. Evening light had turned them dull gold. Behind every handle lay a portion of the town, roofs and drains, walls and steps, plots and pipes. The arrangement was not beautiful in the way of a painted landscape, yet it possessed the beauty of things patiently accounted for. There was room in it for the bend of a curb, the width of an alley, the exact place where a bridge allowed dry shoes to pass over water. He thought of the people moving through the mapped streets at that moment. A baker would be sweeping flour from the paved path. Someone at number 18 might stand in the new porch, shaking rain from an umbrella. The market square fountain would hold a shallow bowl of cloud. The lime trees on Briar Lane would release drops whenever a bird shifted among their leaves. At the allotments, the straight fence would be dark with damp, with the rhubarb on one side and the water butt on the other. Letters would wait behind the red wallbox door for the evening collection. The map room did not need to witness these things directly. It received measurements, forms, sketches, and notices, each bearing a little of the world's texture in official disguise. A note saying oak boards suggested rings in timber and the smell of wet wood. A line saying paving complete contained the rumble of a barrow over new brick. 14 green circles held the future shade of 14 trees. Paper was quieter than the town, but not empty of it. Mr. Vale turned off the lamps one at a time. Each green shade went dark, leaving a soft afterimage on the polished table. The final lamp stood near the door. Before switching it off, he checked the kettle, the tap, and the windows. The aspidistras leaves caught the remaining grey light. His umbrella waited in the oversized copper stand, now holding a small pool around its tip. His coat had dried except at the shoulders. He put it on, folded his scarf once around his neck, and took the umbrella, though the rain had ended. In the corridor, the linoleum reflected the ceiling lights in long pale strips. He locked the map room door and tested it with a gentle turn of the handle. The key was heavy brass, worn smooth on one edge. He carried it downstairs, where Mrs. Dowlow was aligning a stack of forms on the counter by tapping their lower edges against the wood. Outside, the courtyard smelled of brick, wet metal, and cooling air. Water trembled on the bicycle saddles. The drain gave one last hollow gulp. Above the roofs, the clouds had thinned into pearl-grey bands, and a small area of evening showed through, neither blue nor silver but somewhere quietly between. Mr. Vale opened the gate and stepped onto the pavement. He walked toward Bell Street at an unhurried pace. The stone shone beneath the lamps, each shallow hollow holding a dim reflection. At the corner, the new wall box was set neatly into the old dairy bricks. Its red paint looked deeper in the damp. A collection plate stated that the final pickup had already occurred. Behind the slot there would be only the few letters posted since then, resting against one another until morning. Farther on, Market Square lay almost empty. The fountain stood in its corrected place, 2 meters east of where older maps expected it. Rainwater filled the basin to the overflow. A leaf floated near the brass button, turning very slowly whenever a drop fell from the rim. Mr. Vale did not press the button. There was already enough water. He passed beneath the clock tower and entered the quieter streets beyond. Willow Crescent was not on his usual route, but he took it this evening because the air was mild and the pavement glimmered pleasantly. Number 18's porch lamp was on. Through the glazed side panel he could see a pair of boots, a folded newspaper, and an umbrella in a blue bucket. The pine frame had darkened with rain. 3 ink strokes in a drawer now acknowledged its existence, which seemed neither important nor unimportant, only properly attended to. At the end of the crescent, Mr. Vale turned toward home. The town around him was full of lines no map could hold for long, water sliding along gutters, smoke leaning from chimneys, light stretching across wet roads, footsteps appearing and fading in the sheen. Tomorrow some line would move, some small object would be installed, replaced, straightened, or given a new number. A form would arrive. A drawer would open. The kettle would begin its low hum. For now, the revised maps lay in darkness beneath their tissues. The new bench rested by the duck pond, its oak slats cool and damp, while beneath it the gravel smelled of chestnut leaves. The paved path behind the bakery waited for the first flower cart of morning. 14 young trees stood along Briar Lane with drops arranged on their smallest twigs. The bridge in Hazel Meadows crossed its narrow channel exactly where it had crossed before, old in position and new in every board. Mr. Vale's shoes made a soft, regular sound. In upstairs rooms, curtains were being drawn. A bus passed at the far end of the road with a low wash of tires, then dwindled until the street was quiet again. He carried the folded umbrella, though there was no rain now, and the evening gathered gently in the hedges, in the narrow spaces beside gates, in the little blue shadows under parked cars, settling over the measured and unmeasured town, over roofs and paths and patient drawers, while somewhere a final drop loosened from a lime leaf and fell without needing to be marked.